This is Lit Squad. Hi, I'm Mark Brody. There's been a lot of talk over the last year or so about the kinds of books students should and should not be reading in school, and what books kids should have access to in libraries. At the same time, there are more books being published that deal with issues of race, gender, and sexual orientation. In this series, we talk to the authors of some of these books. R. Eric Thomas writes for TV, the stage, and has written two nonfiction books, but he's now jumped into the young adult genre with a novel called Kings of Bmore. It tells the story of two black queer best friends, one of whom is moving away. Before that, though, they have a grand day out together. Here's my conversation with Thomas about why he decided to write for young adults.
Well, I remember really vividly, there was a transition that I went through as a young reader. My school had like a lower school library and then an upper school library. And the upper school library was sort of more of a general library, and the lower school was children's, middle grade, and young adult. And I remember sort of passing through those doors as my reading level changed, and having a couple years where I was always kind of floating in between those two spaces. And I remember that period being really vivid in terms of emotion and curiosity and change. And I wanted to honor that period for other readers and for myself. I've always loved novels. I've always thought in terms of fictional worlds, and I really thought that it would be a treat for myself as a writer to go back to that space and to create something new.
Did it turn out to be as much of a treat as you thought it would be?
I have to say it really was. This was the easiest book I've written, which, like, I was like, "Why wasn't I doing this all before?" And I thought it would be a little harder because, I'm 41 years old, and the main characters in the book are both 16 years old, and they're living in the present. And so I had to do, a lot of like logistical research, talking to teenagers that I know, like what platforms do you use to message, what are you listening to, how do you see the world. But at the end of the day, what I was doing was also just creating fully formed human characters. The main characters are both black kids, they're both queer kids, they're both out, and so I was both giving them a part of who I used to be, but also giving them a part of who I've learned how to be in the present. And I think the sort of basic humanity kind of bridge all these gaps. It's also just a very fun book, and so I created this cast of characters that I like to refer to as like a Muppet movie cast. Um, just a lot of big personality, and that was a lot of fun to return to every day.
That's so interesting what you said about how you combined who you were at that age, but also who you have learned to be and putting those attributes back in a couple of 16-year-old kids. Such an interesting comparison.
Yeah, yeah, and I wanted to be very careful not to give them any knowledge that's adult knowledge, that's things that I've earned or learned over the years. But I did know that, the person that I was at 16, I want better for him. And I think that both because of the changes in time and also just sort of the circumstances that Harrison and Linus, our main characters, live in, they can have a little bit more and they can see themselves more fully and more expansively.
So I want to ask you a little bit about the research that you did because I'm so intrigued by the concept of grown-ups writing, characters who are teenagers or young adults. And I always go back to those movies where, police officers or detectives go undercover in high school and, they think they're going to fit in and they walk around saying things that maybe they said 20 years ago when they were kids. Like, I would
Hmm.
imagine it was, you referenced being able to talk to teenagers that but like, how much did you have to sort of take out of your mind what life was like and what being a teenager was like when you were a teenager? Because obviously 41 is not old, but to a 16-year-old, like that's ancient.
Oh, absolutely. Oh my goodness. Yeah. I mean, I went back to my old high school, and I did different conversations for other projects, and I'm sort of in the back of my mind thinking through like this project and taking information like a little magpie, and realizing as we're talking that the world that I knew was completely different. And I went to a gay straight alliance meeting at my old high school, and they were like, what was the Gay Straight Alliance like back then? And I was like, the what? Like, we didn't, the words didn't even make sense to me. So I knew that in writing this, that there was one, culture moves so quickly. So, I wrote it a year and a half ago. I knew that by the time it got published, it wouldn't make sense to be using slang or any references to songs that were popular back in January of 2020 or before then. So I had to sort of detach a little bit and remember sort of for me what the core of being a teenager was, which a lot of times was just enthusiasm and curiosity. And the difference was I didn't have the internet. So my enthusiasm and curiosity was using going to the library. I was very into microfiche
Oh,
back then.
yeah.
Like really just like real detective work. And these kids can just Google, one of them is very interested in Broadway, very obsessed. And he just gets to Google Audra McDonald Tony Award performances all the time, which is what I do. But I'm like, that is the gift of time that bridges all ages is Audra McDonald.
What was it like writing these particular characters, knowing sort of the political climate in which you were writing, in which not everybody is okay with kids reading stories about gay characters?
Yeah, no, I thought about that a little bit, and I think that I remember my experience of being a teenager and understanding how my mind was expanding and changing the conversations that I was having, and so I think there's a lot of different texts that are appropriate for kids. What I wanted to do with this book was to basically create kind of a John Hughes movie in print form with these two characters who you wouldn't necessarily see in a John Hughes movie. It's loosely an homage to Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and in that sense, there is. I think people have a lot of concern about what am I going to read in this book that's going to expose my kids to ideas that are too mature for them, and that's just not a concern that is accurate for this book. Because these are humans first, and they're exploring the world in a sort of day-long adventure. And I didn't set out to make it a very like this book must be PG, but I did set out to make it a book that reinforced that these kids are kids, that they are coming into their own in the world, and that the adventure that they're having is outside and in public and centered around joy. And so, yeah, they do go to a pride parade and they do go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And for some people, those are places that that they don't want a kid. I just simply don't agree that that's not appropriate. And I think the text bears that out.
That was author R. Eric Thomas. I'm Mark Brody, your host for the Lit Squad podcast. If you like this episode, subscribe and leave a rating wherever you get your podcasts. Lit Squad is a KJZZ original production. It was produced by Sativa Peterson. Until next time, thanks for listening.